We need this, guys. It's been way too long.
I'm in. Fishing, beers, and no wives for a whole weekend. Count me in.
Are you sure about this, Tom? I heard some creepy stories about those woods.
Oh, come on, Ben. Don't tell me you're scared of some campfire tales.
It's not campfire tales, Tom. People have gone missing in those woods. And there's been talk of Bigfoot.
Bigfoot? Are you serious? You're letting Ben scare you with his ghost stories. We're going fishing, and that's that.
Man, it's creepy out here. The trees look like they're closing in on us, and the shadows are playing tricks on my mind.
Lighten up, Ben. It's just the forest. We've been planning this trip for months. We're here for some fun. Remember all those stories we heard about this place? It's part of the adventure. Think about the fish we're going to catch. Imagine the stories we'll tell when we get back.
Tom kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine. The tales of the haunted forest echoed in his mind. The woods seemed to be closing in, the air getting heavier with each passing mile. The fog was thickening, making it hard to see beyond a few feet. He turned up the radio, hoping to drown out the silence that felt thick and oppressive. The static from the radio only added to the eerie atmosphere.
Did you see that? Something just moved out there in the trees.
See what? I don't see anything. Maybe it's just an animal.
I thought I saw something. In the woods. It looked like a shadow, but it moved too quickly.
It's just your imagination, Tom. We've been driving for hours and the forest can play tricks on your mind. Let's just focus on getting to the campsite. The car continued its journey deeper into the forest, the headlights cutting through the thick fog. The friends tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but the forest seemed to whisper secrets they couldn't quite hear. As they finally reached their destination, they began setting up camp. The familiar tasks of pitching tents and starting a fire brought some comfort. Sitting around the campfire, they shared stories and laughter, trying to ignore the feeling that they were being watched. The forest, however, remained silent, its secrets hidden in the shadows. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Despite the warmth of the fire, a chill lingered in the air, reminding them of the eerie forest surrounding them. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced around the campsite. The friends tried to shake off their unease, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Eventually they settled into their tents, hoping for a good night's sleep. But as the forest grew darker, the sense of foreboding only deepened. Outside, the shadows continued to move, and the forest seemed to come alive with whispers and rustling leaves. The adventure had only just begun.
The truck lumbered around a bend, and they came to a sudden stop. The forest around them was dense, the trees towering high above, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the distant call of a bird. Standing in the middle of the road was an old man, his face weathered and creased like leather. His clothes were tattered, and he looked like he had been living in the woods for years. His eyes were sharp and piercing, and they seemed to see right through them. He held up a gnarled hand, his eyes boring into Tom. The intensity of his gaze was unsettling, and Tom felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as if the old man knew something they didn't, something important.
Excuse me, sir, can we help you? Tom's voice was steady, but there was a hint of unease in it. The old man didn't respond immediately, just continued to stare at them with those unnerving eyes.
The old man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Tom's. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached, and the forest around them seemed to hold its breath.
You boys heading up to the lake? His voice was rough like gravel, and it sent another shiver down Tom's spine.
We are, Tom's friend Jack answered. He tried to sound confident, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. Do you know the way? Jack asked, hoping the old man could provide some guidance. They had been following a map, but the forest was dense and confusing.
The old man let out a low chuckle that sounded more like a growl. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest, and it made the hairs on the back of Tom's neck stand up. "I know these woods better than anyone. My advice?" His voice was low and serious, and it carried a weight that made Tom and Jack listen closely. "Turn back while you still can." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. It was clear that the old man was not just giving a casual warning. He was genuinely concerned for their safety.
"What do you mean?" Jack asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. He glanced at Tom, who looked equally puzzled. "What's wrong with the lake?" Tom added, trying to understand the old man's cryptic warning. They had heard stories about the lake, but they had dismissed them as just that, stories.
"These woods ain't for city folk." The old man's voice was filled with a kind of weary resignation, as if he had seen too many people ignore his warnings and pay the price. "There's things here that you wouldn't believe, things you shouldn't disturb." His eyes were filled with a kind of haunted knowledge, and it was clear that he had seen things that had left a deep mark on him.
"We're just here to do some fishing, sir," Tom said, trying to sound reassuring. They had no intention of causing any trouble. They just wanted to enjoy a weekend in the great outdoors. "We won't be any trouble," Jack added, hoping to ease the old man's concerns. They were just a group of friends looking for a bit of adventure.
"The woods don't care about your intentions." The old man's voice was filled with a kind of grim certainty. It was clear that he believed the forest had a will of its own, and it was not a benevolent one. "Turn back now, or you may never come out." The warning was stark and final, and it sent a chill through Tom and Jack. They exchanged a glance, both of them wondering if they should heed the old man's advice. And with that, he turned and melted back into the trees as if he were never there. The forest seemed to swallow him up, and the road was empty once more. Tom and Jack stood there for a moment, the old man's words echoing in their minds. They had a decision to make, and it was not an easy one. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the engine and the distant hoot of an owl. The night was thick with an unsettling quiet, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. The forest around them seemed to breathe, each rustle of leaves a whisper of secrets long forgotten. Tom looked at his friends, their faces pale in the fading light. The journey had taken its toll, and the weight of the old man's words hung heavily in the air. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of the cryptic warning they had received.
What do you think he meant? The question broke the silence, but it was one they had all been pondering. The old man's eyes had been wild, yet there was a sincerity in his voice that was hard to dismiss.
"Probably just some crazy old hermit." The words were meant to reassure, but they fell flat. The old man's appearance had been disheveled, but his warning had been clear and precise.
But his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, they all felt a gnawing doubt. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering secrets of their own.
He seemed serious. The gravity of the old man's words was hard to shake off. They had come too far to turn back now, but the unease was palpable.
Come on, guys. The attempt to rally the group was met with hesitant nods. They had a destination and they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. We're not going to let some old man's ramblings scare us off. We're practically there. The words were meant to instill confidence, but the shadow of doubt lingered.
He put the truck in gear and drove on, the weight of the old man's warning heavy in the air. The road ahead was dark and winding, each turn revealing more of the dense, foreboding forest. The woods seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in like grasping claws. The headlights of the truck barely pierced the thick darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered. They finally arrived at a clearing, a dilapidated wooden cabin standing at the edge of a still black lake. The sight was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden structure barely holding together.
This it is. The words were simple, but they carried a weight of finality. This was their destination, their home for the weekend, our home for the weekend. They began to unpack, each movement slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to delay the inevitable.
But even to his own ears, his voice sounded strained. The cabin's appearance was unsettling, its dark windows like empty eyes staring back at them. The cabin looked ancient, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a skull. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, each of them feeling the weight of the old man's warning. They had come seeking adventure, but what they found was a sense of foreboding that none of them could shake. They tried to make the best of the situation, setting up camp and trying to bring some semblance of normalcy to the eerie surroundings. Laughter was forced, conversations stilted, each of them casting nervous glances at the dark forest around them. As night fell, they huddled around a campfire, the flickering flames casting long shadows. The warmth of the fire was a small comfort against the chill of the night and the unease that had settled over them. They shared stories to pass the time, some light-hearted, others more sinister. The ghost stories seemed to take on a life of their own, each tale adding to the growing sense of dread. One of the friends, eyes wide with fear, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. They clutched their flashlights tightly, the beams of light cutting through the darkness, but revealing nothing. The old man's warning echoed in their minds, a constant reminder of the danger that might be lurking just beyond the reach of their lights. The cabin stood in the moonlight, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was a place out of time, a relic of the past that held secrets they were not meant to uncover. Finally, they decided to go inside the cabin, hesitant but determined. The door creaked open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and decay. They stepped inside, each of them feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The interior was just as dilapidated as the exterior, with dusty furniture and cobwebs in every corner. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time, and the sense of abandonment was overwhelming. They explored the cabin, finding old relics that hinted at the lives of those who had once called this place home. Each discovery was tinged with a sense of melancholy, a reminder of the passage of time and the inevitability of decay. An old photograph caught their attention, a snapshot of a family that had once lived here. The faces in the photo were smiling, but there was something unsettling about their eyes, as if they knew a secret that had been lost to time. They decided to settle in, trying to make the best of it. The unease was still there, but they were determined to enjoy their weekend. They set up their sleeping bags and tried to bring some warmth to the cold, empty cabin. As the night wore on, the cabin seemed to come alive with the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the distant hoot of an owl was a constant reminder of the wilderness that surrounded them. They huddled together, finding comfort in each other's presence, but the sense of foreboding never truly left. One by one, they drifted off to sleep, but their dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. The old man's warning echoed in their minds, a haunting reminder of the danger that lurked in the darkness. They had come seeking adventure, but what they found was a night filled with fear and uncertainty. As dawn broke, the first light of day brought a sense of relief. The mist rising from the lake added an ethereal beauty to the scene, but the events of the night before were still fresh in their minds. They had survived the night, but the old man's warning still hung over them like a dark cloud. They stood by the lake, looking at the cabin that had been their refuge and their prison. The adventure they had sought had turned into a test of their courage and their resolve. They knew that the weekend was far from over, and the challenges they faced were just beginning. With a renewed sense of determination, they walked back to the cabin, ready to face whatever the day would bring. The old man's warning was still a shadow over their hearts, but they were determined not to let fear control their actions. They had come seeking adventure, and they were not going to let anything stand in their way. As the group began to settle into the cabin, Tom decided to take a brief walk to clear his head. The forest was still and quiet, the only sound his footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. Just a few yards from the cabin, he stumbled upon an old, weathered sign partially hidden by overgrown foliage. Brushing away the leaves, he read the chilling words, "Beware of the beast." Pause too. Tom's heart raced as he called out to the others, his voice echoing through the forest. They quickly gathered around the sign, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. The old man's warning seemed to take on a new, terrifying significance. Suddenly, a movement caught their attention. In the distance, they spotted a large, hairy, ape-like figure moving swiftly across the hill. The figure stopped for a moment, its dark, piercing eyes meeting theirs. Time seemed to stand still as the creature turned its head towards them before disappearing into the dense forest. Pause 2S. The men were left in stunned silence, the reality of the situation sinking in. The legend of Bigfoot, a story they had always dismissed as a mere tale, now seemed all too real. The forest around them felt more menacing, each shadow hiding potential danger. They knew they had to be cautious. The adventure they had sought was turning into a test of their courage and survival instincts. The old man's warning echoed louder in their minds, and the sense of foreboding grew stronger. As they returned to the cabin, their steps were more deliberate, their senses heightened. The forest that had once seemed like a place of mystery and excitement now felt like a living, breathing entity, watching their every move. The night ahead promised to be long and filled with uncertainty. They gathered around the campfire, the flickering flames a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. Each of them was lost in their thoughts, the image of the beast lingering in their minds. The legend of Bigfoot was no longer just a story, it was a reality they had to face. The men were trying to sleep in the cabin, but sleep was elusive. The forest outside seemed to be alive with whispers and rustlings, each noise amplifying their anxiety. The creaks and groans of the old cabin only added to their unease. Then, in the dead of night, a strange noise outside jolted them awake. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by heavy footsteps that seemed to circle the cabin. Heartbeats quickened as they exchanged nervous glances, each man gripping his flashlight tightly. With a mix of dread and curiosity, they walked over to the window, their breaths held. Peering through the glass, they saw it, the face of Bigfoot. The creature's dark, piercing eyes stared back at them, filled with an intelligence and a primal ferocity. Time seemed to freeze as they found themselves face to face with the legendary beast, separated only by a thin layer of glass. The air was thick with tension, the cabin walls feeling like a fragile barrier against the powerful presence outside. Every second stretched on, the silence between them and the beast almost deafening. They could see the creature's breath fogging up the glass, its eyes never leaving theirs. In that moment, the reality of their situation hit them harder than ever. This was no longer an adventure or a test of courage. It was a confrontation with the unknown, a brush with a myth that had come to life. The legend of Bigfoot was no longer a story to be told around campfires. It was a living, breathing entity, staring them down. As the creature finally turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, the men were left in a stunned silence. The encounter had shaken them to their core, leaving them with more questions than answers. The forest outside was no longer just menacing, it was a realm of untold mysteries and dangers. They knew that the night ahead would be long and filled with uncertainty, but one thing was clear. They would never forget the night they came face to face with Bigfoot. The men stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the window where Bigfoot had just been. The silence was shattered by a sudden thunderous crash. The door of the cabin burst open, and there it was. Bigfoot, in all its terrifying glory, standing in the doorway. Panic erupted. The men scrambled to their feet, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light around the room. The creature's massive frame filled the entrance, its eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and menace. Screams filled the cabin as the men tried to find an escape. One man lunged for the back door, but it was jammed. Another tried to barricade himself behind a piece of furniture, but it was no use. The creature's growl reverberated through the room, a sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. In the chaos, one of the men grabbed a makeshift weapon, a heavy wooden chair, and swung it towards Bigfoot. The creature swatted it away effortlessly, its strength undeniable. The men were outmatched, their fear palpable. The air was thick with terror as they realized there was no easy way out. They were trapped in the cabin with Bigfoot, and the legend had become a horrifying reality. The creature took a step forward, its eyes never leaving them, and the men could do nothing but scream and pray for a miracle. In that moment, the boundaries between myth and reality blurred irrevocably. The encounter was no longer just a story to be told, it was a nightmare unfolding before their eyes. And as Bigfoot advanced, the men knew that their lives would never be the same again. As dawn broke, the search party set out to find the missing men, their hearts heavy with worry. The forest was eerily silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They followed the path the men had taken, their flashlights flickering in the early morning light. The search party arrived at the cabin, and what they found chilled them to the bone. The once sturdy structure was now a scene of devastation. The door hung off its hinges, and the interior was in shambles. Furniture was overturned, and the floor was littered with fragments of ripped clothes and splatters of blood. The leader of the search party stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the wreckage. There were no signs of the men, no trace of where they might have gone. Just the haunting evidence of a violent struggle. Outside the cabin, one of the searchers made a discovery that sent a shiver down their spine. Giant footprints, far too large to be human, trailed away from the cabin and into the dense forest. The prints were deep, suggesting a creature of immense size and weight. The search party exchanged uneasy glances, the realization dawning on them. The legend of Bigfoot was no longer a tale told around campfires. It was real, and it had taken their friends. The footprints were a stark reminder of the terrifying encounter that had taken place. They knew they had to report their findings, but the fear lingered. The forest felt more menacing now, the shadows deeper and the silence more oppressive. As they made their way back, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the creature was still out there, lurking in the depths of the forest. The search party's discovery would send shockwaves through the community. The encounter with Bigfoot had become a grim reality, and the search for the missing men had only just begun. The forest held its secrets close, and the men knew that uncovering the truth would come at a great cost. The legend had come to life, and it was more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The search party, shaken by their harrowing discovery, gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the scene. As they boarded the minibus, the tension was palpable. Each member glanced nervously at the dark forest, half expecting the monstrous figure to emerge from the shadows. Suddenly, one of the men froze, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed to the top of a nearby hill. There, silhouetted against the rising sun, stood a large, hairy, ape-like creature, Bigfoot. Its eyes seemed to bore into them, a silent warning not to return. Panic swept through the group. Heartbeats quickened, breaths came in short gasps. The men scrambled into the minibus, fumbling with the keys in their haste. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle sped off down the forest road, tires kicking up gravel in their desperate escape. As they drove away, the creature remained on the hill, watching them vanish into the distance. The legend was no longer a mere story. It was a living nightmare that had come to life, and it was watching. The men knew that this encounter would haunt them forever. The forest held its secrets, and Bigfoot was the darkest of them all.